Welcome to Untangling Traditions. Today we'll be speaking with Dr. James Mallinson, reader in Indology and Yoga Studies at SOAS University of London. He's also the principal investigator of the Hatha Yoga Project, a 5-year ERC project focusing on producing 10 critical editions of and translations of yoga texts. James Mallinson has published 8 books, all of which are editions and translations of Sanskrit yoga texts, epic tales, and poetry. His most recent book, written in collaboration with Dr. Mark Singleton, is The Famous Roots of Yoga, published by Penguin Classics in 2016. So welcome, Jim. You're editing and translating a Vajrayana Buddhist text called the Amṛtasiddhi for the Hatha Yoga Project. What is the significance of this text for the history of yoga and alchemy?
The Amṛtasiddhi is the oldest of the 10 texts which we're editing as part of the Hatha Yoga project. And it is the earliest known text to teach any of the practices and principles of Hatha Yoga, i.e. yoga in which physical techniques predominate. So in itself, it's extremely important in the history of Hatha Yoga. It's also important, I imagine, I mean, I'm somewhat of a sort of interloper here because I'm no expert on the history of alchemy, but because it frames its teachings, its understanding of the yogic body and the practices which are used upon it within alchemical metaphors. So for that reason, I mean, it's certainly very important in the history of Hatha Yoga, and I imagine it's probably also very important in the history of alchemy. I say some of these things rather tentatively, because of course I'm eagerly awaiting the outputs of the Ayuryog project, which no doubt will much improve my understanding of the history of Indian alchemy.
How prevalent are the alchemical metaphors in yoga texts composed after the Amṛtasiddhi?
Well, that's one of the, that's a very interesting thing about the text. The Amṛtasiddhi itself has been, I've been working on it. I worked it out the other day for, I think it's 12 or 13 years. And there have been sort of various breakthroughs along the way in understanding how the text functions. One of which was a few years back, I suppose probably 4 years ago or so, where in particular with the help of our colleague Peter Daniel Santo, we realized that the text was composed by Tantric Buddhists, Vajrayana, in a Vajrayana milieu. And then I've read it in various different groups over the years. And then the most recent one was this wonderful workshop we held in Italy on this island of Procida, where we gathered lots of scholars who had all the expertise I thought was necessary to really, crack all the remaining problems in the text. In fact, there were still a few problems left over, and it was only just after that workshop that I realized, in fact, that a lot of these strange terms, which no one really could make complete sense of at the workshop, derive from Indian alchemical traditions. And I think, I'm not the only one. I think I have many predecessors among Sanskrit scholars in India, writing about yoga, who similarly failed to understand these alchemical metaphors. It's very interesting, in fact. What we see is that the teachings of the Amṛtasiddhi are drawn on in some detail concisely, but clearly drawn on directly by the composer of a text called the Amṛtasiddhi Prabodha, which Jason Birch is editing for the Hatha Yoga project, which is the first text really to Hatha Yoga named as such, and it uses that term to denote the practices taught in the Amṛtasiddhi. And it then borrows these alchemical metaphors. For example, the Amṛtasiddhi uses the term samputta, which is a kind of dual-chambered alchemical crucible to describe the body when it's locked at the top and the bottom of the central channel. So you apply a throat lock and a perineal lock, and that creates this sort of chamber. And it uses this term samputta, which it took me a while to realize was couched in alchemical terminology, or was drawn from alchemical terminology. And the compiler of the Amṛtasiddhi Prabodha gets this. In fact, it's quite clear because he uses a different term. He uses dviputta, okay, which is a synonym, and I can't remember where it occurs, but I guess maybe it fits the meter better than Samputa, which is metrically different. And so we can be certain, I think, from looking at Ayuryog or Prabodha, that the alchemical terminology was understood. But then subsequently, the metaphors, so that, we see a lineage of Hatha Yoga texts often drawing on their predecessors, almost invariably drawing on their predecessors. But pretty quickly, the alchemical metaphors are no longer understood. And I think a good example of this is in the Amṛtasiddhi, there are 4 stages to yoga practice: Arambha, Ghatha, Parichaya, and Nishpati. And so the second one, Ghatha, is equated with the Samputa stage, okay, where you've blocked the top and the bottom of the central channel to create this enclosed chamber. And Ghatha, of course, is one of the first words that people learn in Sanskrit, means a pot. And we also find that term in alchemical treatises to describe similarly a kind of closed alchemical crucible. By the time we get to a text, say, such as the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra, okay, which is not much later. I mean, we know it's got to be before the sort of the very latest, the middle of the 14th century. In that text, it uses the same structure of 4 stages, but the Ghatha stage is interpreted as being the stage in which basically your progress in yoga gets going, it's activated, and it connects it with the root, the Sanskrit root ghatate. It says within the text, this is the state in which yoga kind of moves forward. So it doesn't understand the alchemical metaphor, which was the original reason for this name. So yeah, so to summarize very quickly, I think the alchemical understanding behind those metaphors is forgotten and misunderstood.
Interesting. So the loss of that understanding, does that mean that medieval yogins had an extensive knowledge of alchemy and the use of elixirs, or is it quite rare? I
think it's pretty hard to confidently project back and be certain about what the medieval yogins and alchemists were doing. I think there's a general confusion. I mean, early on in scholarship on this subject, the two things have long been seen as very close. So David White, most sort of best known of recent scholars of the subject, in his magisterial encyclopedic work, The Alchemical Body, which I think was published in 1996, and he really identifies yoga and alchemy. And I wasn't convinced by that when I read it, because the text I was looking at the time didn't seem to have this similar identification. And I think really he was drawing quite a lot on scholarship that had focused on South Indian traditions, which they do seem to equate siddhas, so these adept masters. Often they can be masters of yoga and they can be masters of alchemy. What I think really is going on, there's a lot of this terminology is somewhat confusing. In particular, the term yogi is often used and has long been used in the Indian tradition for at least 1,000 years, probably more, often to denote practitioners of things that we wouldn't understand necessarily as yoga. It can mean almost a magician, and often it does seem to have that meaning. So early travelers' reports, Marco Polo and Al-Biruni and so forth, when they're talking about yogis, when they say what they're doing, they're not saying anything that we would recognize. Always, in fact. That it's more what we would understand as alchemy. They go on about them making special pills out of quicksilver, mercury, and so forth that enable them to fly or to live forever or extend their lives. And what I think one of the reasons for this is that the term yogi has been used historically to refer to any kind of tantric practitioner. And the tantric traditions encompass all kinds of different spiritual techniques, including yoga, but also including, mantra practice, alchemy, antinomian sort of cremation ground practices and so forth. So quite often we'll see people talking about yogis when we might think, if they were going to be specific, you would say alchemists. So I think to a great extent, they probably were separate, but they were part of a wider tantric milieu. So a lot of the terminology is shared between them. We do see later on, I think, in the Gorak Bani, so the sayings of the old Hindi poems attributed to Goraknath or Gorakshanatha, he differentiates between Rasayanis and yogis. What I would also say is that in the early Hatha Yoga texts, so after the Amṛtasiddhi Prabodha, we've had the Amṛtasiddhi, 11th century, Amṛtasiddhi Prabodha, I don't know what Jason Birch's latest guesses at the data or inferences of the data, but probably 12th, 13th century perhaps. There, obviously, the two traditions are firmly entangled, but once we get to the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra, which can't be much later, we actually see them quite clearly opposed. In some places, I think in the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra, there's a list of obstacles to yoga practice, included amongst which is Dhatuvada, which can be, which is what we might understand as alchemy. And at the same time, we get these, like in the Shiva Samhita as well, and in the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra, these sayings that these claims that the yogi, if he, by smearing his urine or feces on a piece of iron, he can turn it into gold, which to me seems like a bit of a sort of, you alchemists over there, you might be slaving away in your laboratories. We can just put our shit on a piece of iron and turn it into gold. So I think we do see some kind of antagonism there as well.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So is there any evidence to suggest that the alchemical metaphors that are used in the Amṛtasiddhi were inspired by Taoism or Chinese alchemy?
I'm pretty convinced they are, but again, I'm a bit wary. My knowledge of Taoism is even smaller than my knowledge of Indian alchemy. But I've dipped into some sort of general overviews, and it's really immediately very clear to me that some of the principles and the ideas are shared with the Amṛtasiddhi in particular, and they've appeared from nowhere within the Indian tradition. Okay, there are innovations within the Indian tradition that one can find in these Taoist texts, which slightly predate the Amṛtasiddhi. So I think in China, as I understand it, external alchemy, so it's kind of material alchemy where you're working with, trying to transmute metals and so forth, that appears around the 2nd century of the Common Era. And then around the 8th century of the Common Era, we start seeing texts which work on inner alchemy, so making these transformations within the body, and they, for example, this idea that we find in the Amṛtasiddhi that we don't find previously in Indian texts, that the breath and the mind and semen are all intimately connected, directly connected. We find that within the Taoist tradition. These ideas of the internal sun and moon and where they're located, there seem to be parallels with that. As I say, I'm a bit reluctant to go much further in. The parallels are obvious to me. There's obviously been some kind of interaction, but I think it requires another big research project with specialists from both traditions to really untangle what's going on there. What has occurred to me when I've been thinking about this recently, because this is all sort of, as I say, it's only been the last year or two that I've really been conscious of these alchemical features of the Amṛtasiddhi. But while there is clearly of principles of what's going on in the body, the practices of Hatha Yoga, the physical practices that we find in Hatha Yoga texts from the Amṛtasiddhi onwards, are not, to my knowledge, found within the Taoist tradition. So there's a difference there, and I don't know where these practices appear from. But yeah, I'm pretty convinced that there's been some borrowing and sharing of the principles within the yogic body that are then worked on by the practices.
So a theme shared between alchemy and yoga is the quest for immortality, and in some cases, rejuvenation. So do you think that these two disciplines were compatible or competitive?
For me, I mean, I would imagine they would be competitive, the two traditions. Like I've said, in some of these Hatha Yoga texts, there does seem to be a kind of antagonistic stance towards the traditions of alchemy. I don't see that they necessarily couldn't be complementary, but on the other hand, I find it quite hard to imagine, you know, in reality, in practical terms, that the same people who are going to be, you know, boiling up potions in crucibles and building these amazing, you know, alchemical laboratories are also going to be the ones that are then off doing, you know, intensive yoga practice, which requires a great deal of dedication as well. And in fact, I do recall, you know, in my experience in India as well, spending time with ascetics, wandering ascetics and yogis, I always remember there was I was in Girnar in Gujarat, in Saurashtra. It was a long time ago now, must be 20, 25 years ago. And these Brahmin Vaidyas would come to the sadhu camps or the ashrams with little beads of solidified mercury, fixed mercury that they'd made. And, you know, in fact, I bought one myself, and I had jata then, and you could, you know, they were made kind of designed so that you could slide it along up your jata. And there was you know, they were the alchemists and the yogis were the yogis, and they were very distinct. You know, there was, you know, certainly I've not come across any yogis, what we would, you know, yogis as in practitioners of hatha yoga in India, who are also alchemists. So I don't necessarily see that they would have to be in competition. I think, you know, certainly within the Nath Sampradaya of tantric practitioners, broadly understood, you know, that has been able to encompass both traditions for, you know, best part of 1,000 years. So I think they can coexist peacefully, but I don't think they were one and the same.
Well, thank you very much, Jim, for sharing not only your extensive and encyclopedic knowledge of the history of yoga, but also this new territory of alchemy. So we look forward to two real contributions in this area. So your forthcoming edition of the Amṛtasiddhi, which we know will be published hopefully this year or next, soon enough. So also your forthcoming chapter in the Alchemy Reader for the Ayuryog project, and then also your other editions that will be coming along as part of the Hatha Yoga project. So thank you very much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Well, thank you. That was great. Thank you very much for inviting me on.